Captain's Logs, 11:43 a.m, 22nd of December 2021.
Who is Captain's Logs?
Hmm?
Who is Captain's Logs?
Captain's Log.
Oh, I thought you said Captain's Slogs.
Not Captain's Slogs.
I thought you were making up some sort of
No.
character.
It was like from Captain Kirk from the Starship Enterprise, who would always go, Captain's Log.
Ah, yeah. And yeah, so I would say that abstraction in this instance isn't exactly definable stylistically. Yeah, these theorists would perhaps suggest that there is more of an intentionality to which describes abstraction. Do you agree with that definition of abstract painting?
In some ways, I personally don't see I don't like to mark out a line whereby something moves from being a figurative or representational work to being an abstract one, because I feel that abstraction is just a word for the description of the language of painting itself, or the language of art itself. It's just like mark making. The difference is whether you are the viewer is attributing those to being a representation of something that they recognise or see, in the world or in their dreams or whatever, like in some form of reality. They perceive these things.
Post-Modernism is a term which accounts for generally the collective failings or neglect of modern society at the time. Because if we think of modernism as having more of a romantic tinge with the rise of scientific and technological enlightenment, there was this kind of hopeful search for absolute truth and the acquisition of intellectual knowledge. But then postmodernism saw that modernist longing for authenticity as a little naive. And that could be potentially due to the rise of commercialism, capitalist economies, the death of dictatorships, mistrust of politicians, technological simulations, and the growing awareness of society as a generally performative structure. And this all sort of fed the ironic or disillusioned sensibility of artists at the time. Would you agree with that interpretation of postmodernism?
Yeah, I think I largely understand what that's drawing on. I think I would say that it seemed to me, if I can make it personal, that when I was studying art, which was sort of the very end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, that there was a shift whereby science and science's reductionism, it was that idea that science somehow would complete everything, understand everything would be there. And a lot of the artists were sort of following, like Mondrian or whatever, lots of people were following this reductionist route in art as well. And there was a sort of sense that technology, that like sort of science would answer our questions. We would, enter a sort of golden age somehow. It was very utopian and sort of very hopeful. And I think at some point we began to question that, as science began to discover that for everything it knew, there were enormous amounts of questions that it couldn't answer. Everything it found brought up more questions.
Yeah.
So I think that led to this kind of idea of what is truth and what is there truth. Are we going to find truth, or is truth relative to cultural things, relative to narrative, to stories around it? Is like the idea of postmodernism became very aware of context to things, and that changed art practice a lot. I think entering of the digital era changed things, because we began to feel that we didn't have to sort of, we could use anything from anywhere at any cultural point in time, any reference. We could have a Doric column next to a abstract expressionism next to. We almost began to just sample genres and sample things it was a sort of freedom to be able to borrow from all cultural points and all times. But a lot of the time, of course, we were taking these things vastly out of context.
Yeah.
So you would borrow something, you would borrow a sound or an image, and that would be taken out in and put into a totally new context. But you would walk through a shopping centre and see, like, you know, there'd be classical columns next to, like, sort of Art Deco next to, you know, it was a very, that pick and mix visual culture was happening. And I suppose that was part of what you said in that thing, that there was a kind of a breaking down of, like, you know, a sort of change in society's views of sort of like from reductionist sort of beliefs really to a more pluralistic kind of viewpoint. Yeah, it was also quite pessimistic.
Yeah.
Which was a little bit tricky.
Yeah, I mean, it's not in that sense, I suppose, when it comes to painting or your studies of looking forward to what art would be, perhaps the tone wasn't entirely hopeful.
No, I felt that there was a great sense that maybe there's a great sense that, like, the sort of image was becoming cheapened, the effect of the image was less. You know, you'd have to resort to much more shock tactics to impress anyone or make any impact. You end up thinking that with all these truths, these multiple kind of versions of things and everything's in its own context, you end up going, well, what's the point? Becomes the big question, is what's the point of art? I mean, I think the as you say, the rise of capitalism as well, like as sort of the overriding ideology, because really we saw the failing of communist regimes, which obviously probably weren't, you know, strictly sort of communist, they were totalitarian, but we saw them fail. And I think the failing of political systems and social systems and the overriding sort of consumerism coming in made you feel that was the only, you know, you didn't have an option.
Yeah.
And art became very tied with commodities and very tied into all that. It became just something that became, in a way, you know, lost its power. I
think that's something I think about a lot and struggle with, is like ideas of like motivation and what the reason or the intention is behind like making the work you're making, and what is it important or why is it important.
I mean, you might see it as graffiti art, but like as like symbols or signs or figures or representational art. I think, there was a marrying of those two, like, you know, whether it was to do with African art or whether it was to do with sort of even earlier art than that, cave painting and whatever. But at the same time, it was actually kind of very, you know, I don't think it was done in a naive way. I think it was really considered as to how it ended up like that.
Yeah, it's a sort of less, I'm thinking back to Whitford's definition of abstraction as something constructed or pure. I feel like it's like pure is almost the wrong word for the kind of art that those people were making, or it was much grittier.
Yes, I think we felt that purity had disappeared, and that we were no longer searching for it. But I had this strange concept, which I still have in my head, which I don't know, that is like the interesting thing of like when something transcends the sum of its parts. So when you put all these things in together and somehow what you look at is not those things anymore, or the elements, and the thing becomes bigger than and more powerful than the elements that go into it. And I felt that to a sense this was a potential thing with this kind of work that actually wasn't the case with the sort of reductionist thing, as you ended up with the pure white square on the white background, or the, you know, geometric. I sort of felt, although some people sort of saw that kind of painting as almost like negating, there was a big question of spirituality, really, and whether it was negating sort of thing, spirituality. But I felt that, perhaps you could express that sort of more from this pluralistic viewpoint, from this point of view of like, amidst all the noise that you created on the canvas, somehow something transcended that, and it became an almost, spiritual experience. That was an interesting concept. It wasn't a sort of very conventional one, I think.
Would you say, so with that, did you feel like you had any particularly strong motivations to paint in this sort of non-traditional, non-representational manner, right? I mean, I think obviously you moved further into symbols as you went on, but thinking more on the idea of perhaps your early work or your abstract work, I mean, were there any particular motivations rather than saying, I'm going to sit down and paint a landscape or paint a portrait?
Yeah, I think there were a few motivations. I think one was a strange motivation, but like it was a motivation of feeling like you look at the incredible representational art of the great masters of the past and you actually wonder what on earth you could add to them, and you actually wonder whether you could create works that in any way lived up to the power of these paintings. You would feel defeated almost by the past, art history's past of incredible, representational painting. And so I think that was a sort of kind of question of like, well, if this has reached its zenith, is it time to sort of look elsewhere? Also, there was a radicalism to it still, which I loved, which was a sort of sense of like, being like, lots of people going like, oh, but I don't understand your painting, mate.
Yeah.
Which I kind of quite like. And I do think somehow that that there was more of a sense of transcendence. The more you lost the object, the more you found the soul.
Yeah.
Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I felt it.
Yeah, no, I felt that too.
No longer sort of tied down. A freedom.
I think I always felt that like with, religious works or growing up in the church, and you see those sort of more traditional style paintings. There was kind of a rise of more churches that actually kind of veered away from the Catholic grandeur and stripped it back to more, simplistic, but also in a sense that now that I'm not part of the church, you can find that sort of spirituality without it having to necessarily be related specifically to one set of beliefs or set of ideologies.
Yeah.
Do you see the definition of abstraction changing, or do you think this idea of kind of intentionality is still important?
Yeah, I think I see that, like, in some ways, abstract painting is continually going to evolve because it's affected by the world around and the world's effect on the artist making it. And as the world changes, the work changes. So I think that's going to change. I think the definition of abstraction is, largely constructed. But yes, so you're coming back to, is it the intention of the artist? And what is the intention when they create the work?
Yeah, I suppose to add to that as well, then it's like, do you feel like the kind of artist's motivation to paint really changes all that much between generation to generation? I
think roughly the reason that people paint or have painted has probably always stayed the same, or made paintings. I mean, I suppose we may have done things like in the past, like that for instance, we painted to ritualistic and spiritual sort of things and shamanistic things and all kinds of reasons that perhaps that sort of thing we don't do in quite the same way. I think the reason for picking up something and making a mark is literally something that we find quite innate, that desire to sort of like create. Really, it's, you know, from everything from leaving something behind ourselves, as we, you know, maybe making things is a way of creating something outside of ourselves, something that lives longer than us, so a legacy, but also, you know, to communicate to others, and also to satisfy something in ourselves that feels restless, the restless mind, to, you know, calm the restless mind.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent I agree with that there are some core tenets, or there's almost an essence to it that stays the same. But then I also can't help wondering that, you know, that it's partly just like in the diversity of experience, looking at between you and me, experience of, like we've said, different kind of social climates, but also the difference as a male painter and then a female painter, that how those experiences impact one's motivation, or maybe even not just motivation but reception. I think it's a tricky balance if you can't negate, I guess, the myriad of experiences and how that influences someone's personal motivation.
No, you can't. And I mean, definitely the way that work is received is very different depending on the age into which it comes, into the you know, era into which it's presented. You know, I think we enter into that thing where, and I think we were doing it a bit in the 90s too, but like there was a point where I felt like painting and just making an image was quite, you know, a sort of brave thing to be doing. I feel now that we have had so many years of modern art history behind us that it does non-representational art behind us. That the problem is that, you know, we are trying to look for ways of being powerful with what we say, and you're constantly fighting now to find language that is powerful and not language that is just like assimilated into this cultural melting pot that like just disappears, and it's like, oh right.
But perhaps that's one thing that's still appealing about abstraction, that it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to a particular gender or race or sexuality.
Yeah, it is without those things to a degree.
I mean, I think it's the external influences, like we've talked, like the art canon, like kind of commercialization and the institution, that perhaps, you know, affect the visibility of it. But yeah, the sort of non-reality or the aim of non-representation, maybe actually gives him weirdly more space for other representation. Well, I suppose then my final question is, how do you feel about the potential legacy that you have left for me?
I feel very delighted that you've grown up and creativity is important to you, and that you are finding ways to express that creativity, and that's leading you into a creative life, and that's a life for all the time that it's something you feel happy with and want to do. I feel excited for you on that journey. The fact that you happen to sort of also have followed into a sort of similar kind of use of language, or you're working out your own language within art, doesn't surprise me. It was never something you could have been doing something quite different, and I would have been just as happy. But like, yeah, I think it is interesting because it does feel like a journey that I went on. I've sort of given you the baton and you've gone on with it.
So there's not really a sense of responsibility in legacy.
What you mean that I feel responsible for?
Or for me feeling responsible to your legacy and to honouring it?
Well, no, no, not really. I don't think so. No, I don't feel like in that way. I feel like it shouldn't be a weight. I mean, I feel like it's great if it's an inspiration, great if it's a catalyst, great if it inspires you. So actually, if like the fact that I painted and did that has inspired you, I feel happy about that. But I wouldn't like to feel like it was an albatross. Really.
Well, I don't think it is. But yeah, I would say it's definitely been an inspiration. But also, I think, like you say, although I've used some of your creative language in aspects of building my own, I think it's that general exposure to creative influence, which is perhaps the most important part of the legacy. And
I mean, that's the exciting thing, is to see you building and challenging and entering into discourse that is your own and that I wasn't involved with, but like, you know, I can see it being a follow on. Actually, I can see, like, you know, the things that your art may be addressing now as a follow on from where we were. You know, it does seem like you're picking up the baton in that way. Yeah. But there are different challenges, different things for your generation that we didn't have. So, you know, but that will make different art.
True.
Which is good.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
You're welcome.
Love you.
Love you.